Now we want to continue on and talk about molecular shape. Okay, so electron pair geometry is where the idea of where are the lone pairs, where are the bonds, and how they arrange. And we know that it doesn't matter how many lone pairs of those number of groups, whether or not they're lone pairs or bonds. You know, if you have 4 electron groups, you get, say, a tetrahedral geometry. So we have these 4 molecules up here that are the same sort of orientation of all those different groups around that atom because they have the same number of electron groups. But when we start talking about molecular shape, these are no longer the same because we only care about atomic positions, not lone pairs. So diagnosing molecular shape is going to be sort of an algorithmic process, just like electron pair geometry. There we just counted total electron groups. We're just going to add the second piece of information as to whether or not there are lone pairs and how many lone pairs there are. So electron pair geometry, that would be this information in the table, what we had right here. And then what we want to talk about is this new information that is dealing with shape and impacts of shape, and we want to look at that. Okay, so when we're talking about electron pair geometry or molecular shapes, it's going to start with the same idea that electron pair geometry is of how many groups do you have. And so the lowest number of groups you can have on a central atom is 2. So you could have a central atom that has 2 outer atoms and 0 lone pairs. So for example, carbon dioxide, we can see the Lewis structure of carbon dioxide is written right here. And so if we count this, we would say the electron pair geometry is linear, right? Because it's 1 group, 2 groups. So we know how to do that. And so we can draw the shape. It's a nice linear arrangement around that carbon atom. If we look at the overall shape of the molecule, we still call that linear because the entire molecule is still linear. The reason why the electron pair geometry and the overall molecular shape are the same is because there are no lone pairs on the central atom. The whole point of shape is to talk about what are the locations of atoms. If there are only atoms bonded to that central atom, there's no lone pairs on it, then that arrangement of atoms is going to be the same as the arrangement of the electron pairs because there were no lone pairs to get in the way. So if you have a central atom with 2 outer atoms and 0 lone pairs, that whole molecule is now called linear. The electron pair geometry of the carbon atom is still linear, and then the shape of the whole molecule is also linear. All right, so what about when we go to a molecule with 3 groups? So we could have a situation where we have 3 outer atoms and 0 lone pairs. For example, CH2O. So I've got the molecule CH2O drawn right here. And so I've got the Lewis structure. If I were to count similarly, I would say 1, 2, 3. That has a trigonal planar electron pair geometry. And if we look at the overall shape of the molecule, it is still called a trigonal planar. The triangle of the outer atoms, right? Shape is all about atoms. And so we can see those outer atoms form a triangle. It's all flat, which is where the planar comes from. So any molecule where the central atom is bonded to 3 outer atoms and there are 0 lone pairs is called trigonal planar. Again, that lack of lone pairs on the central atom means that the name of the shape is the same as what the name of the electron pair geometry was. All right, so we can start to add some complication. When we have 3 groups, they don't all have to be bonds. We could have a situation where we have 2 outer atoms and 1 lone pair. For example, SO2. If we look at the SO2 molecule, you can see I have 1 group from the single bond to oxygen, 1 group from the lone pair, and 1 group, the bond to the double bond to oxygen. So we would call this a trigonal planar electron pair geometry, right? Because there are 3 groups. And so the overall shape of the molecule is going to look like this. We know we have that 120-degree bond angle. We know that the lone pair is taking up one of the spots up here, right? So that's the overall shape of the molecule. That lone pair takes up space. If we plot out a 3-dimensional representation of where the atoms are, here the red sphere would be the sulfur and the green spheres are the oxygens. And we can see that now the overall shape of this molecule is, if we only care about atoms, that lone pair doesn't show up, we don't still have a triangle. So we're describing the atoms, we call this shape bent. This is no longer a linear molecule like we saw previously. It's a bent molecule. That shape name is literally just describing that the molecule, the atoms, are in a bent line. If we step up to 4 groups, we can start in a similar place of having 4 outer atoms. That'd be CH4. We know what the structure of CH4 looks like. It has a carbon atom bonded to 4 hydrogens. There are 4 groups. We've arranged them to show the 3-dimensional representation, right? That dash is those bonds going into the board. The wedge, the bond is coming out. We call this tetrahedral. We know this is that characteristic 109.5 degrees for bond angles. There are no lone pairs on that central carbon atom, so the overall shape is tetrahedral. The idea of a tetrahedral shape comes from the fact that these hydrogen atoms, the outer atoms, are filling the points of what's called a tetrahedron. Tetrahedron is a shape where all the sides are equilateral triangles. So it's kind of similar to a pyramid with a triangle for a base. And so that tetra means 4, hedra means angle, so 4 angles. There are 4 hydrogen atoms pointing out to the 4 corners of that tetrahedron. This can be a harder shape to conceptualize since it is 3-dimensional, but it is really the idea is you're kind of filling those points. This orientation of tetrahedral corresponds to the maximum spreading between 4 groups in 3-dimensional space, right? So if you break the plane, you make that kind of 3-dimensional space, point out in those 4 opposite directions. And then here's a kind of a GIF of just showing an animation of what this shape is. It can be hard to imagine. Unfortunately, we can't work through like touching models or anything in this sort of remote setting, but you can kind of get a GIF. Hopefully this general idea. Also in the lab, you'll be playing around. You'll make a model like what you're seeing here, and you'll be able to kind of move it around and see the relative positions of atoms in a tetrahedral molecule. Okay, so let's add some complications now of lone pairs. So when we have 4 groups, you could have 3 outer atoms and 1 lone pair. So an example of that would be ammonia, right? NH3, where it still is going to have 4 groups. So it has a tetrahedral electron pair geometry where it is bond lone pair, and then we can see these bonds have the dashes and the wedges. And so, we're overall looking at this tetrahedral shape. We would expect to have the 109.5 degree bond angles. The lone pair has taken up some of our room. It fills that spot. But now, when I look at just the molecule for the shape, we call it trigonal pyramidal. Okay, so similar names we've seen before. Trigonal, again, is a reference to the fact that these outer atoms form a triangle. But it's not planar anymore. Instead, it's a pyramid with kind of the nitrogen atom sitting at the top of that pyramid. So it's kind of a squat pyramid, but still the hydrogen atoms, those outer atoms, are in a triangle that's in a plane below that central nitrogen atom. And so that's called a trigonal pyramidal shape. Whenever you have 3 outer atoms and 1 lone pair, you're always going to get a trigonal pyramidal orientation shape for the molecule. Again, shape name, only talking about atoms. All right, so the final one is if we have 2 outer atoms and 2 lone pairs. So example of this is water, right? We can see we have 1 bond, 2 bond, 1 lone pair, 2 lone pairs. And so the electron pair geometry is still going to be tetrahedral. Our bond angles are 109.5, like we'd expect. But the shape, and they take 2 of those 4 spots. But when we start talking about the shape, it's now going to be called bent. We actually reuse the name bent for 2 different possibilities. And so in this bent orientation, you have these 2 different 2 bonds. It's only the 2 bonds sticking out in different directions. It's not a linear molecule. So we call this a bent shape. Again, the electron pair geometry is representing those lone pairs, tetrahedral orientation, but the shape only cares about atoms, and you have a bent molecule. So again, diagnosing shape, figuring all this stuff out starts with figuring out number of electron groups, just counting in the Lewis structure. Everything comes off the Lewis structure. That immediately gives us information on electron pair geometry and bond angles. Determining shape just comes from taking that number of electron groups and figuring out how many of them are lone pairs, and then we can interpret that right here. If you were taking this test in person, I would give you this table. I have a useful information up on Blackboard that has this table. I encourage you to print it out, to use it when you're taking the test. You don't have to memorize these things. You can always look them up. But this sort of shape diagnosis comes from counting electron groups and then counting lone pairs. All right, so to help us with this, let's do a couple of examples. We want to predict the molecular shapes of the following molecules. And this is really what we want to be able to do. Be given a molecular formula, and from that, come up with ideas about the shape and arrangement and all of that. So if we want to get there, the first step is always going to be draw the Lewis structure. Right? That's why we worked on drawing Lewis structures for a while, because now we're going to apply that to our shapes. That's our first step. And the reason why I'm going to draw that Lewis structure is we're going to count how many groups of electrons are around the central atom. How many lone pairs, how many outer atoms. Add those together. Right there, you have the arrangement. Right, boom, you have your arrangement information. Next, how many outer atoms versus lone pairs? You just counted them all. So just parse them out into the two different types. From that, you get shape, right? And usually we just count lone pairs, but you could count outer atoms. But usually the idea is how many lone pairs is what we use. And so with those kind of just comes a matter of interpreting the Lewis structure. So we'll start with NO3 minus nitrate. Here is the nitrate Lewis structure. And analyzing that, I can see right away that I have 3 bonds to outer atoms, right? 3 outer atoms, 3 oxygens. It doesn't matter that they're single bonds or double bonds. There's just 3 things I'm bonded to. So there are 3 directions that electrons point out from my central nitrogen. There are no lone pairs, right? Just the 3 bonds. So I call that a trigonal planar arrangement. And because there's no lone pairs, the atoms are arranged in the exact same pattern for the shape, so it's a trigonal planar shape. And in fact, if I get an actual depiction of the actual molecule, I can see that they are spaced out in the 3 different directions. And I can predict that the bond angles are 120 degrees, right? Because they're fully spaced out. You will notice that there are these dashed lines around here. That is indicative of resonance structure. So the fact that this nitrate, we know the double bond could be anywhere. So really, they're all a mix of double bond and single bond. And so that is shown there, and that's why we have all equal bond lengths in this depiction of the molecule, right? So we can depict a bit more with our 3D, but this is all so far so good. Okay, so CH2Cl2, methylene chloride. So I can see here I have this carbon atom in the middle, and then I want to look at what is on that carbon atom. And so I can see I have 4 outer atoms, and again, no lone pairs on the carbon. So that means there are 4 directions for electrons to stick out, and that corresponds to a tetrahedral arrangement. There are no lone pairs on my central carbon atom, so it is a tetrahedral shape. And if I plot out what this shape is, I can see that the chlorines basically are sticking out and the hydrogens are sticking out. If I want to draw a 3-dimensional Lewis structure, I have 2 single lines, then I have 1 wedge and 1 dash. I have that overall tetrahedral shape. And so I can see that these are a tetrahedral shape. My bond angles are approximately 109.5. Just like I saw with lone pairs, it's not going to be perfectly 109.5 because they're different atom type. Not necessarily going to balance all perfectly, but what we want to think about is just that kind of average number, 109.5. If it was an ideal position, everything would be 109.5, and they are very close in practice that it's not really worth it for most things to get more into it. But I have a tetrahedral shape because I'm bonded to 4 things, and I have 0 lone pairs on the central carbon atom. Phosphorus trichloride. I got the Lewis structure shown up here. If I take a look, again, I'm bonded to 3 things, right? 3 outer atoms, 3 chlorines, and there's a lone pair on the phosphorus, right? So that takes up some space. That is one of the things. So now when I say I'd have 3 outer atoms plus 1 lone pair on the phosphorus, so this would be 4 directions for electrons again, giving me a tetrahedral arrangement. But this time, because I have a lone pair, my shape is going to get a different name. And the different name is going to be trigonal pyramidal. So I know I could arrange it out. That lone pair is really sitting up here on top of the phosphorus, but I don't necessarily represent that or care about that for shape. Instead, all I care about for shape is the fact that I have this pyramid, basically where, you know, phosphorus is at the top, and then the chlorines are then at that triangle bottom or a trigonal bottom. I can see that's kind of sitting right there. And again, I'm going to have lone bond angles right around 109.5, but for this one, I know they are going to be less. I know for a fact they're going to be less than 109.5 because that lone pair takes up some extra space on top of that phosphorus. So it kind of pushes those chlorines down a little bit, not too much, but a little bit, that they're a little bit lower than 109.5 for the bond angles. SCN minus is thiocyanate ion. So this is actually one of the major structure problem we did last week, but SCN minus. So I got double bonds from carbon to the sulfur and the nitrogen, and that's it, right? So the carbon is bonded to two things here, two different atom types here. And so I have that. I can see, you can take a look at that, and there's no lone pairs. So there's just two directions for electrons, giving me a linear arrangement. And again, the lack of electrons on that carbon make this a linear shape. Okay, so this would be a linear shape for my molecule. If I get a depiction of the structure, the sulfur is yellow, carbon's black, and that nitrogen is blue. They are three atoms in a row. And so that is just a straight line, giving it a linear shape. The bond angle, right, is this bond angle between those is 180 degrees. They are perfectly opposite of each other, pointing in those fully opposite directions. That's about as far apart as two things can get in space. All right, so if I take a look overall, you know, nitrate, the CH2, Cl2, PCl3, and SCN minus, I can get all sorts of shapes. And for these sorts of small molecules, I have a lot of flexibility, you know, with what their shapes are. And there's a lot of variety. Now, there's only so many shapes, but, you know, all these different molecules can have all sorts of shapes. And those tetrahedrals arrangements, you know, you can start to see, depending on lone pairs, what sort of arrangement the atoms are going to take and what the kind of molecules are going to look like. And again, you will make some of these shapes. Really encourage you to take some time, kind of look at those molecules and get a really kind of a good hold on what a tetrahedral shape is, or a trigonal planar shape, and those sorts of ideas. Participation 626, question 3. For each of the following compounds, identify molecular shape and give the bond angles. First is CH2O, second is H2S, and third is ASH3. This is the third question on participation 626, due Friday, June 26th at 11:59 p.m. over on Blackboard. Link to the assignment is right below the links to these videos. Again, for each of the following compounds, identify molecular shape and give the bond angles, CH2O, H2S, and ASH3. All right, another question for participation 626. Finding a few early this time, but more videos to go. See you there.